Hello and welcome to the M Word CIC. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Steve back in with me. Today's a very special session because we met literally by reading his original article around his experience for himself and his daughter, who was really struggling at school. Now, obviously, I don't know the histories and all the ins and outs of it, so I'm going to keep my mouth very quiet and shut so that Steve can take over and really tell us the experiences for himself as a head teacher and then himself as an experience with his parenting in and around his daughter who started to deteriorate with her mental health. So set the scene for us, Steve. What was it like as a, because you were a head teacher, weren't you, in a primary setting? Is that right?
I was, yeah, thank you. First of all, morning, thank you for inviting me back.
You're welcome.
Um, yeah, so setting the scene, I was formerly a primary school head teacher. My background is in primary education. I've been a teacher since 1999, worked most of my career in schools in Lancashire, specifically in Blackburn with Darwin. And then about 7 years ago, we relocated to Lincolnshire. So my second headship has been in a large rural primary school, three form entry. So untypically large for a primary school. Both of my headships have been in three form entry schools. One was very, very urban. One was very, very rural. Um, I left headship last year. Sadly, the reason for that being that my own health has suffered. I caught COVID in December 2021, which developed into long COVID and which has left me with a number of long-term chronic health issues.
Gosh.
I had some time off work, well, 5 months off work completely when I was originally bedbound and housebound. I then went back to work for 7 months but found I no longer had the energy or the physical or mental capacity to do what is ultimately a very responsible and high pressured and demanding job. And so I took the decision to leave of my own accord because I wanted to take control of a situation. And that was January 2023.
Right. Okay.
So
That sounds
since,
horrendous. Absolutely horrendous in itself, doesn't it?
yeah, I mean, it warrants a whole podcast of its own, really. But um, I'm 48. I've previously been fit and healthy and active, and a very good track record in terms of my health and my attendance at work. I've never had prolonged absence, never suffered with health issues other than mild asthma. And this has been life changing for me and for our family. So, officially I'm unemployed. I left work over a year ago. I am still trying to make sense of life and my new life and trying to focus on my own recovery as far as possible, but living with an illness which has no treatment, which is, has as much skepticism as it does support,
Yeah.
is quite difficult. But that's my background, 24 years in education. The last year has been navigating my own ill health, and that's coincided with supporting my daughter, one of my daughters, who has really suffered with anxiety.
So kind of set the scene before we kind of um sort of learn about her deterioration. Set the scene on what your kind of viewpoints were, because I find this really interesting and I think it's really important that we kind of get our head around, pardon the pun, with understanding what your headship was like when we think about young people who were struggling to come into school or parents coming to see you. Because I know in a previous episode you've said that you could happily have filled your entire working week, not day, week, with trying to problem solve a lot of the issues with parents coming in, with their concerns. So set the scene for us. What was it like with you being ahead, thinking about mental health? for all your young people, and including your staff in some respects, but predominantly your young people. What was that like?
Well, I think I alluded to this last time we met. Sorry, I can hear an echo. I don't know whether that's me.
No, I can't hear
Okay.
anything.
Um, so I became a head in 2011, left in 2023. I would say, and I think other current school leaders are agreeing that there's now two phases of headship. There's the old world, pre-pandemic, and there's the new world. Some people say we're post-pandemic. I believe we're still in the pandemic, and that's my own view. I
Yeah,
think we're in the pandemic era, and what people are saying is running a school, teaching in a school in those two different times are very, very different. So if I think back to my early years of headship, um, mental health has always been a factor. It's been a factor for staff, for parents, for pupils. But I can honestly say, in the early part of my headship, it was very rare to be um, supporting, working with a family whose child was suffering with their mental health. Now, my experience is primary. But we did have children who suffered with mental health issues and with varying types of anxiety, but it was fairly rare. And I was lucky we were in a very deprived, challenging area, one of the top 20 most deprived council wards in Britain. So that
yeah,
comes with lots of challenge.
yeah,
Um, but it meant that when we had children who were struggling, we wrapped our arms around them. We had family support workers. We had back in those days we had EWOs, and the service was quite proactive.
yeah,
Um, we had a mental health team that we could draw upon, um, and I would say it was manageable. It was a part of the job. It was always a tricky part of the job and very delicate, but it was something which didn't dominate school life.
yeah,
Obviously, for the people involved, it dominated their lives, but
yeah,
from a head teacher's perspective, it was quite a rarity. Over the years, that really changed at some pace. And about 5 years ago, 2019, I wrote a blog. The reason I wrote it was 20 years since I'd become a teacher. I was feeling quite reflective. And I kind of I wrote this blog about where we were at in the education system and how things had changed, just generally. And one of the things I wrote about was mental health. And in this paragraph, I wrote how we were seeing, and this is 2019, so pre-pandemic
pre-COVID. Yeah,
anywhere.
yeah,
Um, I wrote a paragraph saying how it was concerning how rapidly children's mental health was deteriorating. And this was based on my experience in a primary setting and how we were seeing children as young as 4 struggling with their mental health, and how services at that point were decimated, and how families and schools were crying out for support, but the wait for support was very, very long.
yeah, yeah.
And so that was 2019, September, before the pandemic anywhere. And then here we are 5 years on, and it's almost like there's been an explosion.
Mm,
And there's barely a week passes now where mental health isn't in the news, where there isn't an article about attendance or unauthorized attendance or children's anxiety or CAMS. And the bottom line is we've reached a place where a colossal number of young people are struggling with their mental health.
yeah,
And I know, obviously, mental health is a broad term, and we're talking about any number of conditions. Some people in and out of the profession think that anxiety is just a few worries, that it's just normal, it's something you should just, face your worries and crack on and it'll be okay. Some people understand the nuances and the actual meaning of an anxiety disorder as well as other mental health conditions. But where we're at now is there are children still as young, the youngest children in school, we're seeing separation anxiety, um, various anxiety disorders, depression, things that weren't the norm even 10 years ago in a primary setting.
Yeah,
Now, secondary has always been a different kettle of fish, and it's not my expertise, but I have plenty of experience in education. And I think what we're seeing is the number of young people who are struggling in secondary education, we should all be alarmed about. Not just educators, parents, the whole of society should be really concerned about what's happening, because I think the latest figures that have been published show something like 3 in 10 secondary age pupils struggling to attend, meeting the persistent absence threshold.
yeah,
And it's just a terrifying number of young people. If we go back, I think, to your original question about my headship, in the last few years, so I left headship last January, but the latter part of my career was in the thick of the pandemic.
yeah,
And we were seeing an increasing number of children who were displaying what mental health practitioners would know straight away were classic traits of anxiety disorders.
yeah,
And that impacts on them holistically, it impacts on their whole family. So, what does that look like in a school? Well, it might be a child literally hanging onto the school gates, unable to get any further onto the school grounds. It might be a child sobbing, holding on to their mum or their dad. It might be a child who's made it into the school entrance, but they can't let go and they can't come any further, and they might be distraught. They might be screaming. They might be lashing out. And these were the things I was seeing. They were the things me and my team were supporting day in, day out, you know, through the latter parts of the pandemic, not the lockdown parts. That was a
yeah.
bit of a different phase, and it was
Did you,
very distressing for the children, very distressing for parents. Parents are trying to go to work maybe, or they're trying to deal with other siblings, or they're on with the day's activities, and the day starts with distress, dysregulation, turmoil.
yeah,
And we were learning as we went along.
yeah,
As educators, at that point, I was a very experienced head and teacher, but we were seeing new behaviors, we were seeing new situations. It was different in every child. And it's stressful. Managing those situations is upsetting.
yeah,
Some things we got right as a school, some things we got wrong. Sometimes I was, in good faith, I would put my hand on a child's shoulder or on the parent's shoulder and say, "It's okay, we're going to be okay, we've got this, we'll work with you." But actually, when you're crying out for other services, for mental health services, and those interventions are a long way off, it's just a sticking plaster.
yes,
So even if you're in an inclusive setting and a compassionate setting and you have some understanding of what's happening, you're basically in a very upsetting, heartbreaking situation, trying to make accommodations, trying to make things as good as they can be. But that's kind of where I left headship.
yeah,
And I'm still in touch. Lots of my friends are teachers, leaders. My wife works in a primary school. Um, I've got good friends in secondary, and these are the things which are now the norm, in inverted commas, in schools of all type. I'll
so
pause.
no, that's all really helpful. Thank you for that. So can I just ask you, did you happen to notice if there was any particular age ranges that you were finding, this growing problem around mental health issues? Or was it just, a steady sort of across the board of ages?
Personally, my experience is that it's been across the board.
Right.
The Where I would say that have been the most complex cases and where children have been the most consumed by anxiety, they've tended to be in key stage two,
Right.
so from year three upwards.
Yes.
But if I'm honest, the separation anxiety,
Yeah.
particularly, I've seen from nursery and reception
Yeah.
upwards.
Yeah.
Um, I guess looking at the whole education spectrum, it's a bigger problem in a mathematical sense in secondary because of the proportion of children.
Yes.
And my understanding, it's were particularly students in years 7 to 9 at secondary, but not
Yeah.
exclusively. So I wouldn't
No.
want to say anything that's misleading. My view is that it can affect anyone at any age. Some age groups, it's a wider problem than others, but I think what people need to understand is that mental health issues can affect anybody. Anxiety and anxiety disorders can affect anybody and can be triggered by any number of things and or can be a trait of any number of uh, things and conditions.
So,
Yeah,
one of the things that I continually see, and I'm pretty sure you see now, across social media, is parents lamenting that schools do not listen to them and insist just get them in, even if they're in their pajamas, just get them into school because we can take over and they'll get used to it or they're fine once you leave. Now, I'm really keen to hear what you did do before your experience with your daughter. So, given what I've just relayed to you, what did you do before you went through your experience?
that's a really good question. And I think, as I said, we got things right as a school and we got plenty of things wrong. And that's the
Yeah.
nature of school life and education. But if I think back to a couple of individual cases, I'm conscious, I obviously won't say any names or anything, but a couple of cases where I would describe them as long-term situations where it started with what you might say were more minor traits of anxiety. I'll be really careful here, but which grew into much more expansive, consuming situations.
Yes.
And um, we would typically, I mean, I would regard myself as very inclusive and supportive, and my team. So we would, my inclusion leader would be involved at an early stage. We would um, we would typically have meetings to discuss what interventions we might be able to put into place to try and reduce a child's anxieties. We had a pastoral leader, so we would make adjustments to children's provision, which might mean rather than coming straight into their class, they might be met by a designated person, and they might be taken to the nurture room,
Yeah.
and they might, the activities might be off curriculum, and there would be things like reductions in the time in school.
Yeah.
So perhaps part-time timetables. We have in Lincolnshire, we have an EBSA team, emotionally based school avoidance. Um, we also have a behaviour support team. So depending on the overall picture, we would involve people as early on as possible. Class teacher, pivotal, making sure that they understand
Yeah.
what's happening. But I think, quite honestly, I didn't know until this happened to me as a parent. I didn't quite understand what was happening with in an anxious child's mind and body,
Yeah.
and I didn't understand or appreciate how much their world was on fire.
Yeah.
And so all of the adjustments and interventions we put in place were in good faith. I believe, they were supportive and compassionate, but I've come to learn and understand that some of the things weren't actually helpful.
Yes. Can you give an
And
example?
absolutely. So, I mean, I guess we'll come on to this, but the blog I wrote last year was called School on Fire. And if I think back to, and this is a common situation now where a child's in distress at the school gate or even at the parent's car or in the school entrance, clinging to a door or a gate or something.
Yeah.
And I've seen children grab a door frame or they've got in, but then they can't get any further, so they grab a friend. Um, and I think your human natural response is is to try and be supportive and compassionate. So, it might be an arm out, it might be a kind word, you'll be okay. Don't worry, we'll look after you.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, even those things don't make entire sense when your world is on fire. Because if you're a child and uh, you're in a hyper you're in a I can't remember the word, hyper vigilant.
Right.
You're in a situation which is causing you anxiety at that very moment, and you're looking at somebody like the head teacher or a teacher or a pastoral leader, and they're saying to you things like, "You're okay," and you're not okay. And you know you're not okay, and somebody who seems to be quite nice but is telling you you're okay and telling you um, it'll be all right in 10 minutes or tomorrow or next week or you'll feel better. Um, and it really kind of causes these mixed messages, I think.
Yes.
Um, and but bigger than that, things like, and this is widespread across the education sector. We do things like saying, well, let's just try 5 minutes or let's
Yeah.
just try 10 minutes.
Yes.
And often that's intended in good faith. It's not meant to be punitive. It's not meant to make the situation worse. But for an anxious mind, that's 10 minutes of absolute hell.
Yeah.
It's like being put into a car crash and somebody saying, just 10 minutes, just hang on for 10 minutes and see how you do. Or go into that burning room, it's just 10 minutes. Or go into this boxing match and somebody's going to beat you up, but it's just 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I didn't really appreciate that as a head teacher. And I hold my hands up 24 years,
Yeah.
but I didn't quite get that because I thought that less was kinder.
Yeah.
So just logically, it's a lower expectation, so the pressure is reduced, which might therefore help the child's
Yeah.
anxiety. But of course, the thing that I keep coming back to is it's less fire, but it's still fire.
Yes.
So it's fire nevertheless.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
if if school is one of the things which is triggering the anxiety, then the focus has to be on putting the fire out. Because while you're doing anything else to try and encourage the child into that situation, it's still causing more anxiety.
Yeah.
And I hope I've articulated that in a helpful way. That's what I didn't truly understand
Yes.
as a head teacher.
And I think the other aspect as well, and you've mentioned this in a previous episode, is if you were an adult and you were really, really struggling with huge levels of anxiety, you wouldn't be expected to be under pressure to go back into work. It would be very much go away and heal, come back with graded exposure to it. The graded exposure for young people can be, I've got many, many young people who've been encouraged to come in for just 90 minutes. But like you say, the fire's not out. It's still going, it's still raging, isn't it? But then you have this really weird situation. So I've got a client right now who's been told you will come back to school, and at the end of 6 weeks, you'll be back to full time. This young person has been out of education for over 2 years. Now, the fire's still raging, in another building, and now they're being forced to go back into this building of fire, and the expectation will be that this young person will return full time after 6 weeks. If they struggled to attend in the first place, why do they think, yeah, you can do this? What's the difference? 2.5 years. What's the difference? Why is this being pushed? And you and I both know this is pretty standard across secondary care education as much as primary education. But perhaps you could give us a kind of an insight as to why this might be.
Yeah, I mean, this really gets to the heart of the matter. I last week I wrote a thread on social media about part-time timetables
I saw it.
specifically for anxious children. And that was really, I've written that after a year of observing and supporting my own daughter and seeing what's happening in the world. And it's a really sad fact that the majority of part-time or reduced timetables, which are implemented for children with anxiety disorders, I'm not talking about those for children with behavioral issues or other factors, but when they're implemented for an anxious child, the majority of them fail.
Yeah,
And as a consequence, a lot of those children whose part-time timetables fail, they are either deregistered from school by their parents, they might be homeschooled or they might not, or they might end up in a situation where they're out of school, but with any appropriate provision in the local authority. And every single one of those cases, in my view, is a tragedy.
yes,
And what we've learned as a family is a part-time timetable for a child with an anxiety disorder can actually work. And there are caveats here, but they can work if everything is put in place that the child needs, if the child is at the center of the whole piece of work.
yeah,
So it's child led, not led by attendance targets.
yes,
And I think to answer your question, where we've got to as an education system is, well, it's baffling in many ways where we've got to, but the current government, and anybody will see this, so this isn't me being anti-conservative per se, but the current government has an obsession with numbers,
yes,
whether it's unemployment, illness, immigrants, schools. It's numbers and targets, and the the political management of school attendance is really curious
yes,
because I've never known a time in my career when so many people have had an opinion about school attendance and about the head teacher's job to manage attendance. So
yes,
just to be more precise on that, it's always been schools have always had targets for attendance. Maybe their governing body set them, maybe the local authority set them, maybe
yes,
the trust set them. And for as long as there have been schools, it's been a school's duty to encourage children to school because that's the purpose. Why wouldn't they? It's just logical.
yes,
So schools have always promoted the benefits of good attendance, and head teachers have always had the overall responsibility for authorizing or unauthorizing absences, and they're basically accountable for children's attendance and absence levels. So it's just always been part of the job.
yeah,
But in the last couple of years, it feels like it's become everybody's business.
yes,
So most of the time I was a head teacher, I managed school attendance. I was interrogated by Ofsted when we had inspections about it. I would submit reports to my governing body or to the local authority. We would be quietly working away, supporting multiple families at any one point with issues relating to their child. But it kind of feels like it's gone into the public domain.
yes,
And so, it's in the press every week, it's on daytime television, everyone's got
yes,
an opinion. But above all that, there's the government and the DFE having campaigns like Moments Matter,
Yes.
or writing guidance which tells schools what they should do around absent pupils. And I mean, I can say this, I think, because I'm no I'm no longer employed, but we're in this almost dystopian system now where too many people have got an opinion and
Uh-huh.
and a hand in attendance, and we really need to hand it back to schools and to the people in the heart of the communities who have got responsibility for the children in their care, so that they can just get on with the job of supporting. But what we've got is targets and pressure.
Yes.
And as we've talked about in a previous podcast, the pressure on head teachers to raise their attendance levels is like it's never been before.
Yes.
And so what that results in some instances, is perverse practice and policy.
Yeah.
And I would really want to be careful because, I'm supportive of schools and the education profession. Some schools have got this just right. They're very supportive, empathetic, compassionate, put in place really bespoke provision. But
Yes.
then, as you mentioned, there are those who say you've got 6 weeks. If you're not back in 6 weeks, this will happen. And
Yeah.
I mean, people get in touch with me all the time now asking for my advice. And there are I've read of parents being interviewed under caution by the police for their child's
Yes.
absence.
Yes.
Um, People being facing prosecution for the second time,
Yes.
um, people being threatened with penalty notices. And these aren't, lazy, uncaring parents who
No.
just let their child skive school. These are families who are crying out for help, in a queue for CAMS,
Yes.
trying to get their GP on board. And it's a real mess. But I think your question, it started with about part-time timetables. And the problem is the DfE's current guidance stipulates that children can be put on reduced timetables, and the wording is something like this should be for the shortest time possible.
Yes.
And my view is that lots of schools and local authorities and trusts are interpreting that as meaning it's got to be this, and they get one shot.
Yeah.
So from everything I hear and read, it's quite typical that a family are told, "We'll put you on a part-time timetable, but it will be 4 to 6 weeks,
Yeah.
and we want them back. And by week 6, they need to be back in full time.
Yeah.
And if they're not back in full time, then this will happen. You
Yes.
might you might be looking at alternative provision, or we might need to, even this, which I find horrendous. If they're not back full time, we're going to go back and make the absences unauthorized because it hasn't worked."
Yes. So,
Um,
but all of this, does it not add more stress on parents and children? Because, the parents will be saying to the child, you really have to go back to school, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. I could end up in prison. The child feels ultimately responsible and yet has no control over being able to change any of this. And for you as a head teacher, and I am keen to find out this, did you ever feel under that level of pressure to enforce a family saying, you've got to come back, we've got to make this work, it's got to be? I know you've said in the past that, nowhere has it been written it's 6 weeks, it's just the professional's interpretation, but have you ever had to be under that level of pressure to, you said interrogated by Ofsted? It's really quite eye-opening, but it feels horrendous, doesn't it? There's pressure everywhere. So did you feel under, as a head, did you ever feel under pressure to sort of get that family back within a short time frame?
in truth, I haven't.
Yeah.
And I believe the overall situation is worse than it was even when I left headship a year ago. So
Really?
I know some heads are just feeling the absolute inordinate pressure, and especially if they're due an inspection, because
Yes.
they're worried about what their attendance figures might look like to an inspector. And of course, as we talked about previously, it can have an incredible weight on the overall judgment that a school is
Yes.
given. So
Yes.
um, there is inordinate pressure. But no, I got, as I said, I've got things wrong around mental health, but I've always um, championed children and supported their families, and I've never bought into you've got to do this by this date. Um, I would quite happily say, well, let's be flexible, let's extend this, let's try this. This hasn't
Yeah.
worked, but maybe we could do this.
Yes.
Um, but that's just my experience.
Yeah. Okay. So let's think about your daughter and what did you notice in the early days? Because a lot of people think it happens like a light switch, it's immediate. But as you've learned, actually, there are a lot of early clues, but easy to miss, would you say?
Totally,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Um, so just a bit of background. My wife and I have four children. They're aged from 7 to 15, and we live in a place where we're surrounded by family. We're supported, and we're a very close knit family. As I said before, we both work in education,
Yeah.
and so I would say that both my wife and I have a good working knowledge of mental health and children's needs. But it happened like this, really. So in September 2022, our oldest daughter was moving to secondary school.
Right.
And up until that point, she'd always had very good health. She was robust. Out of all our four children, if anybody ever got ill, she would bounce back the quickest. She was, so her attendance was great, from all through primary school. And she was popular. She was bright, funny, really liked by staff, plenty of friends, enjoyed learning. To be fair, and in truth, she enjoyed the lockdowns when we were at home. She was a child who quite enjoyed being at home,
Yeah.
and one of her sisters really missed school and hated the fact that she couldn't be at school. This My oldest daughter was quite content at home and to have the attention of different parents at home. But she was moving to secondary school. Where we live, we it's a little bit old-fashioned. We still have the 11 plus, and we still have grammar schools. And in our particular town, they happen to be single sex, which is it's worth noting because I think it's something that's a bit different when you've got to think back about everything. And she was moving from a one and a half form entry mixed primary school to a single sex girls grammar school. Big change. It's the school that her mum went to many years ago. It's the school where her grandma taught for many years. It's just down the road, so it's we see it. It's part of our life. There was until she started, we had no reason to believe there was any issues around that.
Right.
Preparation for school. I mean, she did very well attainment-wise in the 11 plus. There were no questions about her academic uh, sort of capacity to cope with the work there.
Yeah.
Um, we did all the usual preparation things like buying the new uniform, um, got her bike ready because she was going to be biking to school, made arrangements with a local girl who she was going to be doing the school journey with. And we started a new school year as a family, all four kids back at school. I was just returning to work after months of absence,
Yeah.
and we just assumed everything was okay. I guess the first signs were um, fairly early on in September. My daughter would mention having a headache.
I'm really grateful to you for all your time that you've given us in doing this. It's been so lovely having you. Thank
Oh,
you
it's an
so
absolute
much.
pleasure.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
I mean, it's a whole world, and if it helps one person, then then that's time very well spent in my view. So yeah, I hope it's been of use.
That's really good. Thank you so much.